The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Clarence's house as Camilla walked briskly through the corridors, her heels clicking against the polished stone. In her perfectly manicured hands, she clutched a cream-colored envelope that had arrived with the morning post. The royal seal was unmistakable, but something about this particular letter felt different. The weight of it, the texture of the paper, even the way her name was written across the front in elegant script, seemed to carry an ominous undertone. Charles was in his private study, surrounded by towers of official documents and correspondence that required his immediate attention. The responsibilities of being king had proven more overwhelming than he had ever anticipated, and lately every day brought new challenges that tested his patience and resolve. His reading glasses perched on the edge of his nose as he reviewed yet another briefing about parliamentary matters when Camilla entered without her usual gentle knock. "Darling, this came for me this morning," she said, holding up the letter with a slight tremor in her voice. "I haven't opened it yet, but I have a terrible feeling about what it might contain." Charles looked up from his papers, immediately noticing the worry lines that had appeared around his wife's eyes. In their years together, he had learned to read her expressions like a familiar book, and right now, every line on her face spelled trouble. The morning light streaming through the tall windows seemed to highlight the tension that had suddenly filled the room. "What makes you think it's anything serious?" Charles asked, setting down his fountain pen and giving her his full attention. "We receive dozens of letters every day. Surely it's just another invitation or perhaps correspondence from one of your charities." Camilla shook her head slowly, her fingers tightening around the envelope. "No, this feels different. The paper is too expensive, too formal, and look at the handwriting. It's not from any organization we know. Someone took great care in addressing this, almost as if they wanted to ensure it reached me personally." The clock on the mantelpiece ticked loudly in the sudden silence that followed her words. Charles studied his wife's face, noting how pale she had become since entering the room. He had seen her face countless challenges with grace and dignity, but something about this simple letter had clearly shaken her to her core. "Well then, let's see what has you so concerned," Charles said, extending his hand toward her. "Whatever it contains, we'll face it together as we always have." But as Camilla began to tear open the sealed edge of the envelope, her hands started shaking more noticeably. The cream-colored paper seemed to mock her efforts as she struggled to open it cleanly. Charles watched with growing concern as his usually composed wife fumbled with what should have been a simple task. "Here, let me help," Charles offered, reaching for the letter. "No, I can manage," Camilla replied quickly, perhaps too quickly. Her defensive response only heightened Charles's suspicion that whatever was inside that envelope was going to change everything. Finally, the seal gave way, and Camilla pulled out a single sheet of paper. Her eyes scanned the contents rapidly, and Charles watched in horror as all color drained from her face. Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. The letter trembled in her hands like a leaf in a storm. "What does it say?" Charles demanded, his voice sharp with concern and growing impatience. Camilla's eyes continued moving across the page, reading and rereading the words as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Her breathing became shallow and quick, and Charles noticed her grip on the paper becoming so tight that her knuckles had turned white. "Camilla, you're frightening me." "What does the letter say?" Charles repeated, this time rising from his chair and moving toward her. When she finally looked up at him, her eyes were wide with a mixture of shock and fear. "It's about Diana," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Someone claims they have information about her death that was never made public. They say they have evidence that proves—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. The mention of Diana's name hit Charles like a physical blow. Even after all these years, any unexpected reference to his first wife could still catch him off guard. The wounds from that tragic time in their lives had never fully healed, and now someone was apparently trying to reopen them. "Evidence of what?" Charles asked, his voice becoming dangerously quiet. Camilla's hands were shaking so violently now that she could barely hold the letter steady. "They claim they have proof that her death wasn't the accident everyone believes it was. They say they have documents, photographs, even recordings that show—" "Show what? Exactly?" Charles's patience was wearing thin, and his tone carried a warning that anyone who knew him well would recognize. "That there were people in high places who wanted her silenced permanently," Camilla finished in a rush. "And they're threatening to release everything to the media unless we meet their demands." The words hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud. Charles felt his world tilting on its axis as the implications of what Camilla had just read began to sink in. This wasn't just idle gossip or tabloid speculation. Someone was making very serious accusations and backing them up with threats. "Let me see that letter," Charles said, his voice now carrying the full authority of his royal position. But Camilla pulled the letter closer to her chest, as if protecting it from his reach. "Charles, maybe we should think about this carefully before we do anything rash. If this information becomes public, it could destroy everything we've built together. The monarchy, our marriage, everything could be at risk." "All the more reason I need to see exactly what we're dealing with," Charles replied, extending his hand more insistently. "I won't make any decisions until I know the full scope of these allegations." The tension in the room had become almost unbearable. Charles could see the internal struggle playing out across Camilla's face as she wrestled with whether to share the letter's complete contents. Whatever additional details it contained, they were clearly even more damaging than what she had already revealed. "There's more, isn't there?" Charles asked, his voice softening slightly as he recognized her distress. "What else does the letter say?" Camilla closed her eyes tightly, as if trying to block out the words she had just read. When she opened them again, there were tears threatening to spill over. "They mention you, Charles. They claim they have evidence that you knew about the plans beforehand and did nothing to stop them." The accusation hit Charles like a thunderbolt. In all his years of public scrutiny, he had faced countless rumors and allegations, but nothing had ever come close to this level of character assassination. The suggestion that he could have been involved in any way with Diana's death was not just professionally damaging, it was personally devastating. "That's impossible, and you know it," Charles said firmly. "Whatever game these people are playing, they've clearly done their research and know exactly which buttons to push to cause maximum damage." "But what if they have fabricated evidence that looks convincing?" Camilla asked desperately. "What if they've created documents or recordings that appear authentic? In today's world, people will believe anything that confirms their existing suspicions." Charles knew she was right. The court of public opinion operated on very different rules than actual courts of law. Perception often mattered more than reality, and once certain ideas took hold in the public consciousness, they could be almost impossible to dislodge. "How much do they want?" Charles asked, assuming this was ultimately about money. Camilla looked down at the letter again, her face growing even paler if that was possible. "It's not money they're after, Charles. They want something much more valuable and much more dangerous." "What could be more dangerous than money in the hands of blackmailers?" Charles asked, though he was beginning to suspect he didn't want to know the answer. "They want you to abdicate," Camilla whispered. "They want you to give up the throne voluntarily, citing health concerns or personal reasons. They say if you don't announce your abdication within 30 days, they'll release everything they have to every major news outlet in the world." The room fell into complete silence, except for the steady ticking of the antique clock. Charles felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. These weren't ordinary blackmailers looking for a quick payoff. These were people with a much larger agenda, people who wanted to fundamentally alter the course of British history. "Who sent this?" Charles demanded. "There must be some indication of where it came from." Camilla shook her head. No return address, no signature, no identifying marks of any kind. Whoever sent this knows exactly what they're doing. Charles began pacing the length of his study, his mind racing through possibilities and implications. Someone had clearly spent considerable time and resources putting this plan together. The timing, the specific allegations, the ultimate demand, everything had been carefully calculated to create maximum pressure with minimum escape routes. "We need to involve the security services immediately," Charles said decisively. "This is clearly a threat against the Crown, and they have resources we don't." "But what if involving them only makes things worse?" Camilla asked frantically. "What if these people have contacts inside the government? What if bringing in official channels is exactly what they're hoping we'll do?" Charles stopped pacing and stared at his wife. The paranoia in her voice was understandable given the circumstances, but it also suggested that the letter contained even more damaging information than she had revealed. "Camilla, I need to read that letter in its entirety," Charles said with finality. "Whatever additional details it contains, I have the right to know. We can't make informed decisions while operating with incomplete information." The moment of truth had arrived. Camilla looked down at the letter one more time, then slowly began extending it toward her husband. But just as Charles reached for it, the study door opened without warning. Kate stepped into the study with the quiet confidence that had become her trademark since joining the royal family. She moved with purpose, carrying a leather portfolio under her arm and wearing the kind of composed expression that suggested she had important business to discuss. Her timing seemed almost too perfect, as if she had been waiting just outside the door for precisely this moment. "Oh, I'm sorry," Kate said, though her tone suggested she wasn't sorry at all. "I didn't realize you were in the middle of something private. I can come back later if this isn't a good time." The interruption had caught both Charles and Camilla completely off guard. Camilla instinctively pulled the letter back toward herself, while Charles found himself frozen between reaching for the document and acknowledging his daughter-in-law's presence. The tension that had been building in the room suddenly took on a new dimension. "Actually, Kate, this might be perfect timing," Charles said, making a split-second decision that would prove more significant than he realized. "We could use a fresh perspective on something that's just come up." Camilla shot him a look that could have frozen fire. The last thing she wanted was to bring anyone else into their crisis, especially Kate, who had always maintained a complicated relationship with both of them. But Charles seemed determined to include her, perhaps thinking that Kate's natural discretion and level-headedness might help them navigate their current predicament. "What kind of fresh perspective?" Kate asked, setting down her portfolio and giving them both her full attention. Her sharp eyes immediately noticed the letter in Camilla's hands and the obvious distress on both their faces. Charles hesitated for a moment, weighing his options. He could ask Kate to leave and continue his private conversation with Camilla, or he could take the risk of bringing her into their confidence. Something about Kate's calm demeanor in contrast to Camilla's obvious panic made the decision for him. "We've received some rather disturbing correspondence this morning," Charles began carefully. "Someone is making very serious allegations about past events and threatening to make them public unless we comply with certain demands." Kate's expression didn't change, but Charles noticed her posture straighten slightly. She had developed an impressive poker face during her years as a working royal, but he could see the wheels turning behind her composed exterior. "What kind of allegations?" Kate asked directly, in a way that suggested she wasn't going to be satisfied with vague generalities. Camilla tightened her grip on the letter and looked desperately at Charles. "Darling, I really don't think we should involve anyone else in this matter. These are extremely sensitive accusations that could have far-reaching consequences for everyone in the family." Which is exactly why we need to handle this properly from the beginning, Charles replied firmly. Kate has proven herself to be both discreet and insightful in difficult situations. Her perspective could be invaluable. Kate waited patiently while this exchange played out, her eyes moving between Charles and Camilla like someone watching a tennis match. But Charles noticed something else in her expression, a kind of expectancy, as if she might already know more about their situation than she was letting on. The letter contains allegations about Diana's death, Charles said finally, deciding that honesty was the best approach. Someone claims they have evidence that it wasn't the accident everyone believes it was. Kate's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Her eyes widened slightly, and for just a moment, her carefully maintained composure slipped. But rather than looking shocked or concerned, she looked almost relieved. Charles found her response puzzling and slightly troubling. "That's a very serious accusation," Kate said carefully. "What kind of evidence do they claim to have?" Camilla stood up abruptly, still clutching the letter. "This is madness. We shouldn't be discussing this with anyone outside our immediate circle. These people, whoever they are, could have contacts anywhere. The more people who know about this, the more vulnerable we become. But we can't handle this alone," Charles insisted. "We need allies we can trust, and Kate has always been someone we can rely on." Kate moved closer to where they were standing, her movements deliberate and calculated. "May I see the letter?" she asked politely, but there was something in her tone that made it sound more like a demand than a request. "Absolutely not," Camilla said immediately. "This is a private matter between Charles and myself. We haven't even decided how we're going to handle it yet. But if these allegations become public, they'll affect the entire family," Kate pointed out reasonably. "William and I have a right to know what we might be facing. Our children's futures could be at stake." Charles nodded thoughtfully. Kate's argument made perfect sense, and he was beginning to think that keeping her in the dark might actually be more dangerous than including her. "She has a point, Camilla. If this situation explodes publicly, everyone will be caught in the blast radius." Camilla looked back and forth between them, clearly outnumbered but still reluctant to share the letter's contents. "There are details in here that go beyond just allegations about Diana. These people seem to know things that should be impossible for outsiders to know." "What kind of things?" Kate asked, her voice remaining steady despite the obviously explosive nature of the conversation. Charles was growing impatient with Camilla's continued reluctance to share the full scope of their problem. "Give me the letter, Camilla. We need to know exactly what we're dealing with before we can make any rational decisions." "Charles, please," Camilla pleaded. "Once you read this, there's no going back. Once you see what they're claiming, it will change how you view everything that happened during that terrible time." Kate stepped forward, her voice taking on a more authoritative tone. "If these allegations are false, then we need to know exactly what lies we're dealing with so we can refute them effectively. If there's any truth to them—" She paused meaningfully. "Well, then we need to know that too." The silence that followed Kate's words was deafening. Charles found himself studying his daughter-in-law's face more carefully, trying to understand the undercurrents he was sensing in her responses. There was something about her reactions that didn't quite fit with someone hearing this information for the first time. "Kate," Charles said slowly, "you're taking this news remarkably well for someone who's supposedly learning about these allegations for the first time." Kate's eyes met his without flinching. "I've always suspected that there were aspects of Diana's death that didn't add up. I've done my own research over the years, and I've come across some troubling inconsistencies in the official accounts." Camilla gasped audibly. "You've been investigating Diana's death without telling anyone in the family?" "I've been protecting this family," Kate replied coolly. "I wanted to understand potential vulnerabilities before they could be used against us. Knowledge is power, and in our position, Ignorance can be dangerous. Charles felt a chill run down his spine. The conversation had taken a turn he hadn't expected, and suddenly he wasn't sure whether Kate was an ally or a threat. "What exactly have you discovered in your research?" Kate smiled, but it wasn't the warm, genuine smile the public was accustomed to seeing. This was something colder, more calculating. "I've discovered that there are people in very high places who have been working very hard to keep certain information buried. People who would go to great lengths to protect secrets that could destroy the monarchy if they ever came to light." "Are you threatening us?" Charles asked directly, his voice carrying both confusion and growing anger. "I'm offering to help," Kate replied smoothly. "But first I need to know exactly what these blackmailers are claiming and what evidence they say they have. We can't develop an effective strategy while operating in the dark." Camilla was backing away from both of them now, the letter pressed against her chest like a shield. "This is insane. You're both talking about Diana's death as if it were some kind of chess game. She was a person, a mother, someone we all cared about. Which is exactly why we need to handle this situation properly," Kate said firmly. "If there really are people out there with damaging information about her death, we need to know what they have and how they plan to use it." Charles found himself caught between his wife's emotional response and Kate's logical approach. Part of him wanted to protect Camilla from having to relive the trauma of Diana's death and its aftermath. But another part of him recognized that Kate's analytical mindset might be exactly what they needed to navigate this crisis. "The letter mentions me specifically," Charles said finally. "They're claiming I had advanced knowledge of plans to harm Diana and did nothing to prevent her death." Kate's expression didn't change, but Charles noticed her hands clench slightly at her sides. "That's a very specific accusation. It suggests they either have fabricated evidence that appears convincing, or—" She trailed off without finishing the thought. "Or what?" Camilla demanded. Kate looked directly at her. "Or they have real evidence of real involvement." The accusation hung in the air like a sword. Charles felt his world spinning out of control as he realized that even his own family members might be questioning his innocence. If Kate, who had always been supportive and loyal, could entertain such doubts, how would the public react? "I had nothing to do with Diana's death," Charles said firmly. "Whatever evidence these people claim to have, it's either fabricated or misinterpreted. I would never have harmed the mother of my children." "I believe you," Kate said. But something in her tone suggested conditional support. But belief and proof are two different things. "What matters is what evidence these blackmailers have and how convincing it might appear to others." Camilla suddenly stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. "How dare you stand there and calmly discuss whether my husband might be guilty of murdering his first wife? How dare you treat this like some kind of academic exercise?" Kate's composure never wavered. "Because emotional reactions won't solve this problem. If we're going to protect this family and the institution we serve, we need to think strategically and act decisively." "What are you suggesting we do?" Charles asked, though he was beginning to suspect he might not like the answer. Kate moved closer to them, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "I'm suggesting that before we decide how to respond to these blackmailers, we need to know everything they know. And I might be able to help with that." "How?" Camilla asked suspiciously. Kate's smile returned, but this time it was unmistakably predatory. "Because I know who sent that letter, and I know exactly what evidence they have." The revelation hit both Charles and Camilla like lightning. Charles felt his legs go weak as the implications began to sink in. If Kate knew who their blackmailers were, it meant she had been involved in this situation much longer than she had admitted. "What are you saying?" Charles asked, though part of him was afraid to hear the answer. "I'm saying that this whole situation isn't as random as you think it is," Kate replied calmly. "The people who sent that letter didn't just stumble across damaging information. They were directed to it by someone who knew exactly where to look and what to look for. Camilla's face had gone white as a sheet. You're working with them. You're part of this conspiracy against us. I'm not working against you, Kate said firmly. I'm working for the long-term stability and security of the monarchy. Sometimes that requires making difficult decisions and taking calculated risks. Charles felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath his feet. You orchestrated this entire situation? The letter, the threats, all of it? Not orchestrated, Kate corrected. Guided. There were already people out there with dangerous information about Diana's death. I simply helped them understand how to use that information most effectively. To what end? Charles demanded, his voice rising with anger and betrayal. Kate's expression became almost pitying. To force changes that needed to be made, but never would have been made voluntarily. The monarchy needs to evolve, Charles. It needs younger, more dynamic leadership if it's going to survive the challenges of the modern world. The pieces were falling into place now, and Charles realized with growing horror that he had been completely outmaneuvered. Kate hadn't just stumbled into their crisis, she had engineered it from the beginning. You want me to abdicate, Charles said quietly. Kate nodded. For the good of the institution and the family. William is better suited to be king in today's world, and my children will grow up in a more stable and secure environment if the transition happens sooner rather than later. Camilla suddenly lunged forward, but not toward Kate as Charles expected. Instead, she moved toward Charles with the letter still in her hands. In that moment, Charles realized that if he was going to understand the full scope of Kate's manipulation, he needed to see exactly what weapons she had provided to their blackmailers. Without thinking, Charles reached out and yanked the letter away from Camilla's grasp. The moment Charles's fingers closed around the letter, Camilla let out a shout that echoed through the study and probably beyond. The sound was raw and desperate, filled with all the fear and anguish she had been holding back since the morning post had arrived. It was the cry of someone watching their world collapse in real time, knowing that once certain words were read aloud, there would be no taking them back. "Charles, don't!" Camilla shouted, reaching desperately for the letter even as he pulled it away from her. "Please, you don't understand what you're doing." But Charles was beyond listening to warnings or pleas. The betrayal he felt from Kate's revelation had ignited a fury he hadn't experienced in decades. He needed to know the full scope of the conspiracy against him, needed to understand exactly how much damage his own daughter-in-law had orchestrated. The letter in his hands represented not just threats from anonymous blackmailers, but evidence of treachery from within his own family. Kate watched this domestic drama unfold with chilling calm, her smile never wavering even as Camilla's distress filled the room. There was something almost serene about her expression, like someone watching a carefully planned performance reach its climactic moment. She clasped her hands behind her back and waited patiently for Charles to read the documents that would change everything. Charles unfolded the letter with trembling hands, his eyes immediately scanning the typed text. What he saw there made his blood run cold. The letter was far more detailed and specific than Camilla had indicated. It didn't just contain vague allegations about Diana's death. It included dates, times, phone records, and financial transactions that painted a damning picture of conspiracy reaching to the highest levels of government. "My God," Charles whispered as he read further down the page. "They have copies of classified intelligence briefings from the week before Diana's death. They know about the security protocol changes that were made without my knowledge. They even have transcripts of private conversations I had with government officials." Kate stepped closer, her calm demeanor never cracking. "Impressive, isn't it? The level of detail they were able to compile. Of course, it helps when you know exactly which documents to look for and where to find them." Charles looked up from the letter, his face a mixture of rage and disbelief. "You gave them access to classified government files?" You've committed treason against the crown you swore to serve. I've saved the crown from a much larger scandal, Kate replied coolly. The information about Diana's death was always going to come out eventually. Too many people knew too many secrets, and in today's digital age, nothing stays buried forever. I simply chose to control when and how that information would be revealed. Camilla collapsed into a chair, her face buried in her hands. You've destroyed us all. Do you understand what you've done? When this information becomes public, it won't just damage Charles, it will bring down the entire monarchy. Not if we handle it correctly, Kate said with maddening confidence. The transition can be managed carefully. Charles steps down citing health concerns or a desire to spend time with his grandchildren. William assumes the throne with public sympathy and support. The monarchy emerges stronger and more relevant than ever. Charles continued reading the letter, each paragraph revealing new layers of devastating information. There were photographs mentioned, images that supposedly showed him meeting with intelligence officials just days before Diana's fatal car crash. There were financial records that appeared to document payments to individuals with connections to the paparazzi who had been pursuing Diana that night. This is all fabricated, Charles said firmly, though his voice carried less conviction than his words. These documents may look authentic, but they're sophisticated forgeries designed to frame me for crimes I didn't commit. Kate tilted her head slightly, her expression becoming almost sympathetic. Are you certain about that, Charles? Are you absolutely sure that some of these documents aren't genuine? Memory can be unreliable, especially when it comes to traumatic events from decades ago. The suggestion hit Charles like a physical blow. Kate wasn't just questioning his honesty, she was questioning his own memory and understanding of events. The psychological manipulation was masterful and devastating. Even if Charles was completely innocent, she was planting seeds of doubt that would grow and flourish in the dark corners of his mind. I know what I did and didn't do, Charles insisted, but his voice was weaker now. I loved Diana, despite our differences. I would never have wanted any harm to come to her. Love and political necessity aren't always compatible, Kate observed quietly. Diana had become increasingly unpredictable in her final months. Her humanitarian work was making certain government officials uncomfortable. Her relationship with Dodi was creating diplomatic complications. There were very practical reasons why some people might have viewed her as a problem that needed solving. Camilla looked up from her hands, her eyes blazing with fury. You're describing the murder of a princess like it was a business transaction. Have you completely lost your soul? Kate's expression hardened slightly. I'm describing political reality. The monarchy has survived for over 1,000 years because it has always been willing to adapt and make necessary sacrifices when circumstances demanded it. Sentimentality is a luxury that institutions like ours cannot afford. Charles was nearing the end of the letter now, and what he found there was perhaps the most shocking revelation of all. The final paragraph didn't just threaten to release information about Diana's death. It also contained detailed intelligence about current royal security protocols, financial arrangements, and private family communications that could only have come from someone with intimate access to their daily lives. You've been spying on us, Charles said, his voice filled with betrayal and disgust. For how long? How long have you been gathering intelligence about your own family? Kate's smile returned, but this time it carried no warmth whatsoever. Since the day I married William, did you really think I would enter this family without understanding exactly what I was getting myself into? Knowledge is power, Charles, and I've always believed in being thoroughly prepared. William doesn't know about this, Camilla said suddenly, as if the thought had just occurred to her. He can't possibly know what you've been doing. He would never condone this kind of betrayal. William knows exactly what he needs to know, Kate replied cryptically. He understands that sometimes difficult decisions have to be made for the greater good of the family and the institution. He trusts me to handle delicate matters that require a more subtle touch." Charles folded the letter and stared at Kate with new understanding. This was never about protecting the monarchy from scandal. This was about power. You want William on the throne, and you want yourself in a position of ultimate influence. "I want what's best for the future of the royal family," Kate corrected, "and that means having leadership that understands the modern world and can navigate its challenges effectively." "You've done your duty, Charles, but your time has passed." The casual dismissal in her voice was perhaps more insulting than any of her previous revelations. Charles realized that in Kate's mind, he wasn't a person with feelings and rights. He was simply an obstacle to be removed through whatever means necessary. "And if I refuse to abdicate?" Charles asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Kate shrugged elegantly. "Then the information in that letter becomes public, along with quite a bit of additional material I've been collecting over the years. Your reputation will be destroyed, Camilla will be branded as a co-conspirator, and the monarchy will be plunged into a crisis that could take decades to resolve. William will still become king eventually, but only after years of scandal and public humiliation that could have been avoided." Camilla stood up suddenly, her face flushed with rage. "You evil, calculating witch! How dare you sit there and threaten us like some kind of mafia enforcer? We welcomed you into this family. We treated you like a daughter." Kate's composure finally showed the smallest crack. "And I've repaid that kindness by ensuring the long-term survival of everything you've worked to build. The monarchy needs to evolve or it will die. I'm offering you an honorable exit instead of a humiliating collapse." Charles looked down at the letter in his hands one more time, weighing his options. He could fight Kate's accusations and risk everything in a public battle where the truth might not matter as much as perception. Or he could accept defeat and step aside, allowing William to assume the throne under circumstances that would forever be tainted by the shadow of conspiracy and betrayal. "You've thought of everything, haven't you?" Charles said quietly. "I've tried to anticipate every possibility," Kate acknowledged. "This transition can be handled gracefully and quietly, or it can be messy and destructive. The choice is entirely yours." Charles stood silent for a long moment, the weight of the crown feeling heavier than it had ever felt before. The study that had always been his sanctuary now felt like a prison, and the woman he had come to think of as a trusted family member had revealed herself to be something much more dangerous. Camilla moved to his side, her hand finding his arm. "Whatever you decide, we'll face it together," she whispered. "We've survived worse storms than this." But as Charles looked into Kate's coldly calculating eyes, he wondered if that was really true. They had faced public scandals and personal tragedies before, but they had never been betrayed so completely by someone they trusted. The letter in his hands wasn't just evidence of external threats. It was proof that their greatest enemy had been living among them all along. Kate checked her watch with casual indifference. "I'll need an answer within the week. The people who sent that letter aren't known for their patience, and delaying will only make the eventual fallout more severe." As she gathered up her portfolio and prepared to leave, Kate's mask of family loyalty slipped away completely, revealing the calculating political operative underneath. "Oh, and Charles? I'd strongly recommend that you don't try to involve the security services or attempt any kind of investigation into how this information was obtained. That would be unwise." The threat in her voice was unmistakable, and Charles realized that Kate had contingencies in place for every possible response he might consider. She had played this game several moves ahead, and he was only now beginning to understand how thoroughly he had been outmaneuvered. After Kate left the study, Charles and Camilla stood in stunned silence, the letter still trembling in his hands. The morning sun that had seemed so bright and promising just hours earlier now felt harsh and unforgiving, illuminating the wreckage of everything they thought they knew about their lives. The game was over before Charles had even realized it had begun, and the crown that had once felt like a birthright now felt like a curse that might destroy everything and everyone he loved. Kate's chilling calm as she delivered her ultimatum would haunt him for the rest of his days, a reminder that in the world of royal politics, family loyalty was just another weapon to be wielded by those ruthless enough to use it.